I've been following American politics long enough to recognize moments that don't simply make headlines but actually reshape the political landscape. What recently unfolded between President Trump and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is exactly that kind of moment. This wasn't just another loud disagreement destined to fade into the background after the next news cycle. No, this was a collision that revealed something deeper, something fundamental about the nature of citizenship, allegiance, and how Americans interpret national identity. Most people watching from the outside likely missed the magnitude of what just happened, because on the surface, it looks like one more political fight in an era overflowing with them. But those who pay attention to the undercurrents of political behavior could immediately tell this confrontation carried far bigger implications. The clash wasn't only about Trump pushing back against a member of Congress. It was about two competing visions of what it means to belong to this country and whether certain behaviors cross a moral line that Americans still take seriously. This is why so many people, even those normally disengaged from politics, felt something shift when Omar publicly mocked the death of Charlie Kirk. Something about it hit a nerve that couldn't be ignored. To understand the full weight of what happened, it's important to revisit the spark that ignited this firestorm. Omar didn't merely criticize a political opponent. She chose to ridicule a man who had just lost his life, while his grieving family searched for comfort. Instead of showing even the most basic human empathy, she amplified mocking memes and cruel commentary online, turning a family's tragedy into a spectacle for her audience. This wasn't the usual partisanship or heated rhetoric that Americans have sadly grown accustomed to. This pierced something deeper because it trampled over a line that has historically united people regardless of ideology: respect for the dead. Even during the most intense political eras of the past, Vietnam, Watergate, the civil rights struggles, there remained an unspoken agreement that death was not to be used as a political weapon. Yet Omar's decision shattered that boundary. And instantly, Americans of all backgrounds felt it. People who rarely agree on anything suddenly found themselves united in outrage. Progressives, conservatives, moderates, apolitical citizens, everyone reacted with a similar sense of disbelief and disgust. It's rare in today's climate to see such uniform emotional recoil, and that alone should tell you how profoundly wrong her actions felt to the public. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Social media, news forums, and discussion spaces erupted with a singular message: Omar went too far. And what made this moment unique wasn't just the intensity of the response, but its breadth. This wasn't a partisan shouting match where Republicans condemn a Democrat or vice versa. It was a moment where everyday Americans, regardless of who they voted for, expressed the same instinctive reaction. Mocking someone's death violates a fundamental standard of decency. Calls for Omar's deportation, questions about her loyalty, and criticisms of her character flooded online spaces. This level of cross-partisan outrage is almost unheard of in today's polarized landscape. But Trump noticed something else, something even more politically significant. While most politicians would have released a brief statement condemning her actions and moved on, Trump recognized that Omar's cruelty had inadvertently opened the door to a far deeper national conversation about gratitude, patriotism, and responsibility. He saw an opportunity not just to criticize her behavior, but to reframe an entire debate about American values. And instead of limiting his response to her comments alone, he highlighted a broader contrast between her attitude toward the United States and the realities of the country she originally came from. When Trump finally responded, he didn't merely call out Omar's lack of decency. He used her actions as leverage to highlight what he considered broader issues of loyalty and belonging. By pointing to Somalia's long-documented struggles, endemic corruption, extreme poverty, decades of civil conflict, and failed governance, he drew a sharp line between the opportunities America provided and the dysfunction many people flee from. His argument wasn't subtle. He essentially asked how someone who came from a country with such severe problems could feel entitled to publicly lecture Americans about morality and governance while simultaneously mocking the death of a fellow American. It was a powerful rhetorical move because it tapped directly into a sentiment many Americans quietly hold but rarely express: the belief that newcomers should show respect for the nation that offered them safety and prosperity. By posing his pointed question, how can someone from a failed state claim the moral high ground over the United States? Trump reframed the entire conversation. It was no longer about whether Omar's meme was offensive. It became a broader judgment about character, loyalty, and gratitude. And once Trump repositioned the debate that way, Omar suddenly found herself forced to defend her identity, her past, and her legitimacy in ways she'd never had to before. Trump's strategic positioning wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, and politically devastating. He recognized Omar's actions as the perfect catalyst to bring long-buried questions back into the spotlight. By mentioning the Somali president's refusal to take her back, a comment that played half as humor and half as commentary, Trump underscored what he viewed as a broader issue of ingratitude. For years, whispers about Omar's immigration history, alleged marriage irregularities, and questions surrounding her naturalization process circulated in political circles, but rarely reached mainstream audiences. The media often brushed them aside as conspiracy theories. But once Trump referenced these long-forgotten allegations on Truth Social, he forced them out of the shadows and back into public dialogue. Suddenly, millions of Americans who had never even heard of denaturalization were discussing it openly. This wasn't an accident. Trump understood that by drawing attention to the legal mechanisms that allow citizenship to be revoked if it was obtained fraudulently, he could shift the national conversation from Omar should apologize to should Omar even be allowed to stay here? That pivot was pure political jujitsu, using your opponent's own mistake to push them into their most vulnerable position. This led to a surprising revelation for many Americans, contrary to popular belief. Citizenship isn't always permanent. While extremely rare, denaturalization does exist, especially in cases involving deception, fraud, or national security threats. For older Americans who lived through eras defined by Cold War, loyalty tests, and stricter expectations of national allegiance, this concept wasn't unfamiliar. Back then, citizenship wasn't viewed simply as a legal status, but as a commitment to shared values and loyalty to the nation. Trump's response tapped into that historical memory, reminding many Americans of a time when allegiance to the United States wasn't a political controversy, but an assumed duty. For older generations, especially those who lived through war, sacrifice, and national struggle, Omar's actions weren't just offensive. They were symbolic of a deeper cultural erosion. That's part of the reason Trump's framing resonated so powerfully. Many Americans instinctively understood the underlying point. Citizenship comes with responsibilities, not just rights. And when someone openly mocks the death of a fellow citizen, it challenges the foundational idea of what it means to belong to the American community. Omar, once seen by her supporters as untouchable, suddenly faced questions that she couldn't deflect with slogans or moral posturing. Her appearance on CNN with Caitlin Collins only made matters worse. Instead of projecting strength, Omar appeared unsettled and defensive. The confidence she normally displays in interviews seemed cracked, replaced with an anxious insistence that she had done nothing wrong. When Collins pressed her about the Frankenstein meme, Omar attempted to dodge responsibility by claiming she didn't have to agree with every aspect of the content she shared, an explanation that felt flimsy given the meme's clear intent. Her tone grew increasingly nervous as the interview progressed. When the topic of deportation surfaced, Omar snapped back with the statement, "You can't deport an American citizen," but even that sounded more like self-reassurance than a firm declaration. And when the pressure intensified further, she resorted to dismissive insults, calling her critics idiots. That moment was telling. In political communication, insults are typically a sign of desperation, an attempt to regain control when the substantive argument has already been lost. The public could sense it. Viewers recognized that Omar wasn't speaking from a position of strength. She was speaking from fear. Her composure cracked, and in that crack, Americans saw vulnerability that contradicted her carefully curated political persona. Perhaps the clearest sign of Omar's political isolation came from the silence of her usual allies. Under normal circumstances, progressive leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders rush to defend fellow members of their ideological camp when they come under attack. Fundraising emails go out, public solidarity statements are released, and social media becomes a battleground of coordinated support. But this time, none of that happened. Omar's colleagues stayed quiet. Influential Democratic voices who usually rally behind her avoided commenting altogether. Even left-leaning donors began to step back, worried that publicly supporting her could damage their own reputations. Behind the scenes, whispers of a potential primary challenge began circulating among progressive strategists. That silence from her own party spoke volumes. In politics, being abandoned by your allies is often more damaging than being attacked by your opponents. It signals that you've become a liability, someone whose presence does more harm than good. And if there's one thing the Democratic establishment has demonstrated over the years, it's that they were willing to distance themselves from anyone who threatens their broader political standing. Omar found herself in exactly that position, isolated at the moment she most needed support. But Trump didn't stop at highlighting Omar's behavior. He contrasted her online mockery with his own actions at Charlie Kirk's memorial service, a gathering attended by tens of thousands of Americans. At that event, Trump wasn't behind a screen or issuing statements from afar. He stood physically beside Kirk's grieving family. Vice President Vance attended. Prominent conservative leaders came together not for political advantage, but to honor a life and support the people left behind. The optics of that moment were striking. On one side, you had a congresswoman circulating cruel memes from home. On the other, you had a former president comforting a family and honoring a life lost. That contrast didn't need explanation. It spoke for itself. Trump's presence reinforced an image of leadership grounded in respect and solidarity. Against that backdrop, Omar's behavior looked even more callous. It wasn't simply inappropriate. It was jarringly out of step with the values Americans expect their leaders to uphold. This visual comparison, Trump standing with a grieving family versus Omar mocking the deceased, was politically devastating for her. It created a narrative almost impossible for her to escape, one that cast Trump as empathetic and principled, while portraying her as cruel and unrestrained. The situation escalated further when reports emerged of an armed individual impersonating law enforcement near the memorial site. Security officials had to intervene quickly to prevent what could have become an extremely dangerous incident. Families were present, children were mourning their father's mentor, and the atmosphere was emotionally charged. The presence of someone with weapons, posing as a security official, introduced an element of real-world danger that amplified the seriousness of the moment. This episode illustrated something many political observers have warned about for years. Reckless rhetoric doesn't exist in a vacuum. Words shape emotions. Emotions shape actions. And when public figures choose to weaponize cruelty, they contribute to a climate where unstable individuals may feel justified in resorting to extreme measures. Omar's mocking commentary didn't merely offend Americans. It added fuel to an already volatile environment. This is why many people view her behavior as more than a lapse in judgment. It symbolized a pattern of political discourse that's pushing the country toward deeper division and greater risk of violence. The incident at the memorial highlighted how fragile the social fabric can become when leaders prioritize shock value over responsibility. This brings us to the larger issue that often gets overlooked: the accelerating cycle of outrage in American politics. In today's media ecosystem, controversy is currency. The more shocking the statement, the more attention it generates, the more money and influence it produces. Politicians, activists, and influencers across the spectrum have learned to capitalize on this dynamic. Outrage has become a profitable business model, but the long-term cost is steep. When political discourse becomes centered around who can provoke the biggest reaction, the incentive structure shifts away from reasoned debate and toward emotional manipulation. Omar's decision to mock a man's death is an example of this toxic cycle at work. Instead of contributing to constructive dialogue, her actions fed the algorithmic beast that rewards hostility. Trump's response, in contrast, emphasized values like respect, unity, and loyalty, concepts often overshadowed in the frenzy of modern political communication. His ability to redirect the conversation showed a form of leadership rooted not in shock, but in principle. And this difference raises an important question for the American public. Do we want leaders who chase clicks, or leaders who understand the weight of their words? The contrast has never been clearer. Character scandals, unlike policy controversies, often leave lasting scars. Voters might forgive a politician for supporting an unpopular bill or making a strategic miscalculation, but they rarely forget actions that reveal something disturbing about a person's moral compass. Once a leader is perceived as lacking basic decency, the damage becomes almost impossible to undo. And that's precisely the situation Omar now faces. Her comments about Charlie Kirk will follow her into every debate, every election cycle, and every public appearance. Opponents will remind voters of her decision to ridicule a man's death, especially his grieving family's suffering. This isn't the type of controversy that fades, it's the type that defines. Trump understood this intuitively. Instead of limiting his criticism to the meme itself, he broadened the frame to include questions about loyalty, gratitude, and eligibility for citizenship. He shifted the public discussion from "Was Omar wrong?" to "What does this reveal about her views toward America?" That shift was politically transformative. It turned a single offensive post into a referendum on Omar's character and her place within the national community. By doing so, Trump didn't just win the argument. He reshaped the battlefield entirely. The introduction of denaturalization into the national conversation caught many Americans by surprise. Most had never heard of it. But once Trump highlighted the concept, public curiosity exploded. People began researching the legal processes, historical cases, and requirements for stripping citizenship obtained through fraud. This visibility created a new pressure point for Omar, who suddenly had to publicly assert that her citizenship was secure, something most elected officials never have to worry about. The fear in her voice during interviews was noticeable, a sign that even she realized the gravity of the narrative forming around her. Meanwhile, silence within her own party grew louder. When political insiders sense a rising liability, they begin distancing themselves. That distancing quickly turns into isolation, which then becomes political vulnerability. Omar's situation reflects a broader shift within the Democratic Party. Leaders once seen as symbols of progressive momentum can be abandoned the moment they threaten the party's stability or public image. And as Omar's mockery of Kirk's death continued to dominate headlines, the likelihood of her regaining that lost support diminished. Politically, once trust deteriorates at this fundamental level, rebuilding it becomes nearly impossible. But as significant as Omar's individual fate may be, the larger issue extends far beyond her career. This moment forces Americans to confront the broader cultural direction the country is heading toward. Do we continue rewarding politicians who prioritize shock value over empathy? Do we normalize behavior that mocks the dead and desecrates moments of mourning? Or do we collectively demand a return to standards of decency that were once universally accepted? These questions aren't about partisanship. They're about the kind of nation we want to live in. Older generations remember a time when public service required dignity, responsibility, and humility. They recall an era when leaders understood that their words could unite or divide millions. Today, that sense of obligation often feels lost. But Trump's actions at the memorial offered a reminder of what leadership can look like when guided by principle rather than personal gain. Meanwhile, Omar's conduct illustrated the consequences of abandoning those principles for online engagement. The contrast between the two approaches revealed a deeper truth about American society. When leaders forget the moral expectations of their positions, the social fabric begins to fray. Restoring those expectations is now in the hands of the voters. During the memorial service, tens of thousands of Americans gathered to honor Charlie Kirk's life and support his loved ones. People traveled from across the country to show solidarity, demonstrating that compassion and respect still hold deep meaning in American culture. Trump and Vice President Vance attended not out of obligation, but out of conviction, sending a message that leadership requires presence, empathy, and moral clarity. This gathering embodied the values many Americans fear are slipping away: unity in grief, respect for the dead, and shared reverence for those who shaped their communities. In stark contrast, Omar continued posting cruel commentary online, seemingly indifferent to the emotional weight of the moment. The juxtaposition between a country coming together to mourn and a political figure mocking the deceased wasn't lost on the public. It symbolized the difference between honoring values and abandoning them. And for many Americans, this moment reinforced a choice: align with leaders who uphold dignity or accept a culture where cruelty becomes normalized. The overwhelming turnout at the memorial proved something important. Americans still care deeply about moral decency. They still believe in honoring legacy, comforting the grief-stricken, and maintaining standards that transcend political divides. Despite the political division dominating modern discourse, the American response to Omar's actions demonstrated that the country still shares some common moral ground. People from across the spectrum condemned her behavior, not because of party affiliation, but because basic decency transcends ideology. This rare moment of unity should not be dismissed. It shows that even in a time when Americans disagree on countless issues, certain principles remain widely held: respect for the dead, empathy toward grieving families, and the belief that public figures should model responsible behavior. These values aren't Republican or Democratic, they're foundational. They are the principles that allow diverse societies to function without fracturing under pressure. Trump's response served as a reminder that leadership is not solely about policy positions, it's also about representing the moral expectations of an entire nation. His decision to stand with grieving families instead of engaging in online insults resonated because it reflected the kind of leadership many Americans feel has been missing from the political landscape. Meanwhile, Omar's actions illustrated what happens when leaders treat cruelty as entertainment and disregard the consequences of their words. In this moment, Americans collectively rejected that approach. Trump's handling of the situation revealed a form of leadership grounded in moral clarity and cultural intuition. He recognized the deeper meaning behind Omar's comments and used the moment to draw attention to broader issues of loyalty, gratitude, and responsibility. His response wasn't just political strategy, it was an assertion of values that many Americans believe are essential to the nation's identity. Omar's actions, on the other hand, revealed a disconnect between personal behavior and public responsibility. Instead of owning her mistake, she doubled down and resorted to insults, reinforcing concerns about her judgment and character. For voters, this contrast matters. It raises pressing questions about which leaders reflect their values and which leaders undermine them. Ultimately, this conflict serves as more than a headline, it's a moment of national self-reflection. Americans must decide whether they want to reward leaders who embrace decency or normalize behavior rooted in cruelty and division. The outcome of that decision will determine the future of political culture in this country. As Americans reflect on the implications of this confrontation, a broader choice emerges, one that transcends Omar Trump or any single political event. It's about the direction of American society as a whole. Do we continue down a path where outrage dominates, where leaders seek attention through provocation rather than principle? Or do we reassert standards of behavior that reinforce unity and preserve the dignity of public life? Trump's actions provided a roadmap for responsible leadership, rooted in empathy, respect, and national values. Omar's behavior served as a warning of what happens when those principles are abandoned for online attention. This moment reminds us that leadership isn't measured by volume or visibility, it's measured by character. The kind of country America becomes depends on whether citizens reward responsible leadership or indulge the politics of cruelty. That decision rests with the voters, and it must be made soon before the erosion of decency becomes irreversible. Now the question is yours. Did Trump fundamentally reshape the political landscape with this move? Should Omar face serious consequences for her actions? And what standards should Americans demand from those who hold public office?